So several years ago, we joined a peer group organization. It's a group of people that come together, 12 companies total, and really take a deep look into each other's business, serve as a virtual board of directors. I'd never had that level of accountability before and wasn't used to that kind of honesty being brought forth to me. A lot of times in a business, particularly with one owner, most of the people at the company are going to tell that business owner what they think he wants to hear rather than what he needs to hear. Well, that's not going to be the case in an accountability group. They're going to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. And that's such a big, big change. Accountability becomes the second core value of Blough Tech in our structure as a whole. We call it, be accountable. And to be accountable, you've got to have a prerequisite, and that's vulnerability. So let me explain what I mean by that. If I'm going to expect somebody to take responsibility, and really that's what we want out of all of our teammates, right? When we hire somebody and somebody comes to work for us, we want to have, sometimes they refer to it as the owner culture, where they act like they own the business. Well, if we want that kind of accountability, we want them to act like owners, then you've got to treat them like owners. You've got to give them that kind of expectation, and you've got to give them some flexibility. But ultimately, what you've got to demonstrate to them first is vulnerability. Look, all of us make mistakes, and in the process of making mistakes, we've got to own those mistakes. Let me give you an example of something like this that happened here fairly recently. I had gone to one of the accountability group meetings. We go on a quarterly basis. I go through this deep dive into our financials and our business plan and all of these different things, and really go through the ringer with these guys, asking lots of hard questions and challenging lots of my ideas. And in the process of being gone for several days, two of my employees got into a verbal argument, pretty intense. Some shouting went on, and some names got called, and this is outside of the norm for our organization. So when I got back, that was the first thing facing me when I returned, is here's these two critical teammates that now really don't like each other, and they've done this in front of everybody else, and so there's this tension in the air, and things are not as good when I got back as they were when I left, or at least it came to the surface. And I did something that was really probably unprecedented in the history of our company, and something that worked profoundly well. So I brought both of them into my office, shut the door. Now, what you probably would expect that the next thing happened is that the walls were reverberating with me yelling and screaming at them and telling them how disappointed I was with them for their actions, and how that I thought I could trust them. And these are probably things that I've said, and certainly I have said in the past. Probably you can relate. That's not what I did. I looked both of them in the eye, and very quietly I apologized to them for failing them as a leader. Dead silence in the room. Completely unprepared for that. Both were prepared to defend their opinions. Both were prepared to defend their actions. Both of them were ready to go to bat for what they had done and why their point of view was right. But when I apologized to them for failing them as a leader and putting them in a position that brought that tension on them, they immediately changed their perspective. And they began trying to convince me that it wasn't my fault, that it really was their fault. And they began to try to fix the issues. And we resolved it very, very quickly. What I had learned in the meeting that I had been at in some leadership training is that when there are problems inside of an organization, it's almost always as a result of poor leadership. I just failed them as a leader. And by owning up to that and being honest, being vulnerable to them, what that allowed them to do is to then accept responsibility for their actions. By me accepting responsibility for my part in it, they then in turn became responsible for their part. Isn't that what we want? We want people to be responsible. We want people to take that ownership culture and apply it to everything that they do. This is something that we try to inject into the very core of everything that we do. We work with very critical systems. People put an awful lot of trust in all of us. I have to put a lot of trust in my staff to make good decisions on the fly, and I need to know that they're going to do the right thing. Let me give you an example of this as well. Just the other day, we were working on a server, and in the process of doing some minor cleanup on that server, we had to turn it off, and we turned it back on. The field technician that was working on it couldn't get it to come back on correctly. It just wouldn't start up. He did everything that he knew to do, and when he reached a point where he realized that It was beyond him. He called a senior engineer in. That senior engineer went over on site, worked with him. They worked, figured out what the issue was. The hard drive had failed of all things just because he turned it off and on. Nothing he had done wrong. It just happened to be bad luck. They replaced that bad hard drive, then started the process of restoring the information, had a little bit of trouble with the restore, called the most senior engineer on the phone, got his advice for what they needed to do, got past that little issue, got everything resolved by about 12 o'clock that night. First thing the next day at about 8 o'clock, they were both over at that customer site to make sure everything was taken care of. And you say, well, that's an interesting story, Paul. What's the moral of it? I never knew any of it happened until after it was completely done. I was completely ignorant of the whole thing. Just a few years ago, that could not have been the case. I would have had to micromanage the entire thing. But by producing a culture of accountability, that ownership culture, by giving them an example of my vulnerability, hey, I make mistakes, mistakes happen, but we own those mistakes, we take responsibility for those mistakes, we fix our problems, they took that what was illustrated in my life, applied it in their day-to-day practice, and we ended up with an extremely happy customer, and I ended up with a good night's sleep that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Accountability is a key part of any organization for them to succeed. If you don't have the accountability in your organization, you're not going to get it by demanding it, you're going to get it by demonstrating vulnerability first.